Good morning and welcome to our community dialogue brought to you by the Herald and Nelson Mandela University. My name is Rochelle de Kock. I'm the editor of the Herald, and I'm so pleased to have you all join us today, where we'll be discussing a very important topic. I mean, we cannot get away from it. We're talking water, we're talking electricity. These are all matters that are of serious crisis that we find ourselves in as a country. And we'll be having quite a panel of experts who will be discussing this topic, but I will hand it over to our facilitator, Siphokazi, who will be introducing the speakers and take us through this very important discussion as we talk about how do we move forward as a country, how do we begin to talk about development, and how do we begin to talk about growth in South Africa when we are facing such major issues such as water and electricity crisis. So please stay tuned and do leave some comments in the comments section. And thank you for joining us this morning. Over to you, Siphokazi.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, and good morning to everyone who's joining us. And if you're joining us from a different time zone, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. And this conversation is also happening, on the back foot of us just having had local government elections, where the questions and issues of load shedding, of drought, of water shortages were flagged as quite pertinent issues amongst various political parties. And those issues continue to persist post-election. Our panelists are going to take us through some of the questions, maybe some of the strategies as well, that we can consider and think about as these issues affect our livelihood from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, and from the practical perspectives in terms of what can we put in place strategically to avoid some of these issues in the future, right? And so our panelists, experts in their own fields, Dr. Kaiser, Ms. Funzani, Mtembu, Veli, Mbele, Tandokazi, Moyo, are going to take us through some of this conversation and give us reflections from their perspectives and from their expertise, of course, and take us through these. I'm hoping, of course, you can join us by engaging with us on the live stream, on the comment section of the live stream you're joining us from, so we can bring the discussion and make it much more richer. So we welcome you to engage with us as the conversation continues. I'm going to go right into it, and I'm going to give the platform to our first panelist, just to offer us some reflections and perspectives from their areas of expertise. I want to give the platform over now to Funzani Mtembu, who is an investment and an economic analyst and an activist who continues to advocate for ethical economic practices in our country and in our society. Funzani's work concerns numbers, of course, as an economist. However, they also factor in how those numbers affect people in society, right? Funzani is also a member of the Forest movement from her previous university. All right, Funzani, over to you.
Thank you so much, Siphokazi, for that intro. Update is that I'm now a development economist. I used to work as an investment analyst, but I'm now a development economist, and that's pretty much the space that I kind of enjoy currently. So I'm greeting you all this morning, and thank you to Rochelle and Siphokazi for the warm welcome, and to the Nelson Mandela University CANRAD and the Herald for creating such a progressive platform where we can all engage progressively. So first of all, I wanted to actually just paint a picture of the kind of economic epoch we find ourselves in, to fully understand the extent of the infrastructure crisis we face as a country and its impact on growth and development. So South Africa, as part of a global community, has post-1994 been integrated into the neoliberal economic ethos or neoliberalism. Some of the features of neoliberalism are A, an open market economy, meaning that the government should intervene in the workings of the market. B, fiscal austerity, where government spending is cut, and we see kind of what I would call regressive tax implementations. And thirdly, privatization of vital economic institutions and public goods. So it's commonplace that one of the most powerful effects of neoliberal rationality, that distinct form of reason, which casts all human endeavor and activities in market terms, is to undermine the rationale, right, for public goods and the very meaning of public interest. And I intend to showcase how this is so in this presentation. So infrastructure development remains crucial in to unlocking development and growth in the country. Today, of course, we are speaking about electricity and water. Just infrastructure in general is one of the crucial kind of factors to unlocking development and growth in the country. We have an infrastructure fund currently that was launched in September of 2018, initially announced seed funding of 400 billion. However, this was reduced to 100 billion in February of 2019. This year, the government diverted infrastructure funds to public wage bill. For the Eastern Cape in particular, there's a backlog in infrastructure development. So this has an adverse effect on the province, as the province has the highest unemployment rate in the country at about 47.4%. So we have seen in the recent midterm budget where the minister actually stated that there will be no bailouts for state-owned enterprises. In his words, he mentioned that the restructuring of state-owned companies informed by an assessment of their relevance is a priority. He later mentioned that he can no longer talk about Eskom, as they have been injecting money into Eskom for 13 years, and that other players should be welcome to put electricity on the grid. So question remains, could this mean that the speculations about privatization of energy in South Africa may come to fruition? And what would this mean for the majority of South Africans who live below the poverty line? What are the implications of privatization, right, in the context of our economy and our social structure currently? So the public sector infrastructure update report reports that 3 energy projects have been gazetted: the Energy Risk Mitigation Power Purchase Procurement Program, the Small Independent Power Producer Program, and the Embedded Generation Investment Program. The projects will create an estimated 2,569 megawatts of electricity generating capacity. That is total investment to be funded by the private sector amount to about 52.4 billion. So for example, between 2017 and 2018 as well, public finance towards climate-related sectors, I think energy sector is one of those sectors, totaled to about 22 billion against the 35.5 billion financed by the private sector in South Africa. So climate finance, which is essentially defined as international public and private finance consisting of new financial resources targeted towards climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, which includes bilateral aid, export credit, multilateral concessional loans and grants, and also can include carbon market and finance and foreign direct investment. So what has happened is that we have seen a growth, particularly in climate finance from the private sector. So I'm particularly speaking about climate finance because I know that's the burning issue currently, specifically when it comes to the energy sector and what has been going on with Eskom currently and our electricity. So what has become increasingly obvious in South Africa and internationally is that there is that growing push for sector sources to dominate financing of climate change projects, right? The financial market, both locally and globally, has realized that financialization and its growth depend on addressing these climate change issues. So this easily translates into climate finance being co-opted into the global financialized economic system. So essentially becoming part of what one will call Wall Street kind of consensus, right? Which is run by financial markets, allowing private capital to exploit the climate crisis for profitability and shareholder returns. So this poses risk for developing countries that are integrated into a financialized global system on subordinate terms, such as South Africa. So subsequently, as neoliberal rationality dictates, the aim is to diminish the role of the state in a just transition towards critical economic and climate factors, such as energy, clean energy. As Palate and Baloyi rightly have said in one of their articles, that institutional reforms aimed at de-risking private financing through state-backed guarantees, public-private partnership in infrastructure financing that settles states with commercial risks and central banking that reduces liquidity and currency risk for private capital are all part of the financialization supported by the inadequate global financial architecture. The effects of these instruments on developing countries have proven to be disastrous, just as financialization has proved to be fatal, particularly in South Africa. The capture and commodification of public goods have created inequalities of access, which particularly hurt women and girls the most, as they are left to carry the burden of care when there is inadequate basic social infrastructure to meet water, energy, and health care needs. At the backdrop of this, it is concerning now that the National Treasury has also released its National Treasury draft technical paper on sustainable finance. And in that paper, the focus is on private finance, while neglecting public sector and international public finance development. So this puts us at a very high risk to the already mounting debt levels seen in the country. So growth in GDP speaks directly to debt levels, and debt service payments are expected to, and the debt service payments at the current moment are expected to average at about 334.5 billion a year. So that's higher than projected spending on healthcare, on social development, and peace and security. And the debt to GDP ratio will grow for as long as the bottom part of that formula, which is GDP, does not necessarily grow. So it is essential that our government prioritizes growth and development by moving away from neoliberal principles that have proved not to yield value for developing countries such as ours. So in conclusion, I implore us to be more critical of the changes occurring within our country, be more critical of neoliberal ethos, and make a collective decision that would support climate change, climate justice, racial and gender justice, development, and growth. So I think one of the important factors to take into consideration is how do we then ensure that even as we go for these changes, particularly when it comes to climate changes or energy transition from coal to clean energy, what are the effects of kind of what one would call neocolonialism, where we see now that there's like a private sector domination, particularly in those very key sectors of in our country. And so electricity being one of the social goods, it's important that we ensure that whatever decision that is made, we consider the fact that over 50% of our population actually live under poverty, under the poverty line. And so what would it mean for us to privatize or for us to have inadequate access, for instance, in electricity, if we privatize all these social goods or we commodify all these social goods and hand them into the hands of market forces? So I guess my presentation was to interrogate that precisely. How does privatization actually, what are the effects of privatization and commodification of public and social goods in a country such as ours? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sis Funzani, for offering that reflection, and also just touching on the question you're raising there for us is to say there's this shift we're going towards in terms of having to look at alternative ways in which we can sustain ourselves and address the crises that we have. But also the question you fundamentally ask is to say, well, we're still in a welfare state, and so who gets left behind, right, when we develop and when we talk about growth. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to now make way for our second panelist to offer their commentary and reflections. I'm going to call upon Veli Mbele, who is an essayist, a social commentator, and Black consciousness activist. Veli's research interests and writings are on the theme of Afro-centric and Pan-Africanist ideas. And those who are quite familiar with Veli's work know him as an activist researcher, and particularly within the Black power spaces. All right, so without any further ado, Veli.
Mute. Okay, I think that's unmute. Right. Thanks so much, Siphokazi, for the generous introduction and the very ease with which you have let all of us settle. Thanks so much. And the welcome from Sis Rochelle earlier. And my salutations to my fellow panelists, Sis Tandokazi. I see you, Uncle Rodney, Gisela, and my warrior sister Funzani, so thank you so much. So what I am going to try and do, right? So I have many other research interests, like you've said, but I particularly want to speak from the perspective of the Black activist world, right? Because I think the activist world is a critical player in effecting social transformations, and that other spaces have monopolized, right, the development, growth, and transformation agenda. And I believe it is important that we strengthen the activist world. So to just kick off, when I shared the advert for this conversation on my Facebook platform, right, a sister and friend of mine, Lerato Ndawe, reacted by something that just struck me. Her statement just struck me. And she said in response, "We are in darkness, literally and figuratively." Right? That was her response to this ad. And the literal part, I think we can relate to, because the issues of the lights going on and off is not difficult to fathom, right? But the figurative part is what really captures me. What would being in the dark mean figuratively, right? So my own interpretation of being in the dark figuratively is how discourse is framed and how that discourse then informs our perception of reality, right? So, and what I literally mean here is, for instance, in this case, right, who says there is a crisis? And if they say there is a crisis, does it mean there is a crisis? Right? Do you understand? And what is the nature of this crisis? Who caused it? And who are the victims of this crisis? Because this crisis would not just have happened through osmosis, right? So there should be somebody who is responsible for this crisis, or some force that's responsible for it. So I'm trying to drill into those types of things. So the first thing I think that is critical is, especially because we implicate Eskom, it is important for us to understand the genesis of our over 500 public entities or SOEs, right? It's important that we understand what their genesis is. What is their genesis, and what was the agenda of our public enterprises or state-owned enterprises, right? Eskom in particular, which have their genesis in the 1930s to 1920s, right? Even long before the National Party came into the picture. Now, the agenda of our SOEs, especially the main ones, right, in rail, freight, telecommunications, electricity, etc., their primary agenda was to help consolidate, right, the project of British plunder after the so-called Anglo-Boer War. That was the primary agenda of what we call those state enterprises, to enable the project of British plunder, right? And later, after 1948, to accumulate their own capital, the Dutch, after the National Party came into being, then continued with their type of capitalist accumulation using the very facility of so-called state enterprises. You would remember they even went as far as to form their own banks, right? Some of you would remember banks like Allied Trust Bank, etc., and a whole range of financial institutions like Sanlam, right? That were then used as part of the toolkit, right, of colonial plunder, right? So the point that one is making is that it is clear and important to understand the genesis and the agenda of these institutions that we expect to serve us now. Eskom and all of our SOEs that we inherited from the previous regime were not established with Black people, and in particular Black women, in mind. Right? So that we expect them today to serve Black people, and in particular Black women, right, is also a poor understanding, right, of our history. Then second to that, we have also not asked the question, right, after 1994, what agenda do we want state-owned enterprises to serve? Given that before 1994, state-owned enterprises served essentially a colonial and capitalist agenda. Have we defined the agenda clearly in ideological terms, not just in amorphous terms, right? That is the first point. The second point is state-owned enterprises that I've mentioned, Eskom included, right? Many of them were involved in large-scale looting of our natural resources before 1994, right? And they have not been held accountable for the large-scale looting. And so the debts that some of them are burdened with, right, have to do with a lot of illicit activity that happened before 1994. A perfect example of this is how Denel came into being, right, with unbundling of AMSCO, right? I don't know if you're aware that between 1974 and 1994, right, AMSCO engaged in looting to the tune of over 500 million, right? And they were assisted by over 27 countries and 192 banks globally to engage in the looting. But even worse, the money that parastatals like AMSCO was looting was also used to carry out atrocities in places like Zimbabwe, Angola, and Zaire, right? So in addition to looting money here, that money was used to even kill other Africans on the continent. And you see, so with the creation of Denel from AMSCO, that level of scrutiny and accountability is lost. The third point, right, relates to the issue that my sister Funzani partly touched and that we don't speak about, right? Now, the looting has not stopped after 1994, right? So you have something that is called illicit financial flows or illicit capital flows, right? Which continues, right? Where companies, especially those that control the South African economy, right, continue in making sure that various forms of capital leave this country, right? Between 2002 and 2011, it was estimated that for that period alone, South Africa lost over $100 billion, right? So it's not called looting because it's done by corporates. So it's given a more fancier term. It's called illicit financial flows, right? But it is serious money in terms of development opportunities that get lost. And it is continuing till this day. As this discussion is happening now, right? Illicit financial flows are continuing. Then there is the other important issue to consider, and my sister also touched on it, the issue of the possibility of a sovereign debt crisis, right, staring us in the face. And you would know, for instance, that around 2019, right, our total debt, was just at over 60%. That was 2019. Currently, the total debt in the country is just at over 80%. And it is projected to increase even further, right? And as you know, that the bigger issue about national debt is not so much repaying the debt, but the cost of servicing that debt. And we are struggling at the moment. But it is also important to understand the source of the debt, right? So that when our people pay for that debt, we must also understand, are we obligated to pay for that debt, or should somebody else be paying that debt, right? Now, one of the things that my sister also touched on is that the debt crisis, depending on who articulates it and who analyzes it, right, is one of the things that's going to be used to push for the privatization of key national entities, right? Because when people are going to be, scared with the whole debt thing, that we have this debt, and to get out of this debt, we need to do the following things. It's also going to be used as a pretext to sell off some of our key state-owned enterprises. But you've also seen another disturbing development as it relates to debt, right? One of the things we've seen is that some of the municipalities, right, were not able to pay salaries, not just in the Eastern Cape. Municipalities were not able to pay salaries. To just show you that this thing is real, right? It is real. Municipalities were not able to pay salaries. You saw the trauma of workers at Denel and at the SABC, right? As a result of the hollowing out of state-owned enterprises and how this is affecting everybody. The last point I wish to make, right, is that in the midst of all of this, right, there is the bigger question, which is the question of leadership. You see, because a crisis by itself should not be reason for us to drown in paralysis, and give up and say everything is going to go down the drain. There's also an opportunity to get proper ethical leadership, right, to take us out of this. But it will depend on a number of things. Whether or not we are diagnosing the problem correctly, that's first. And secondly, whether we have a reasonable or sufficient number of people that we can classify as ethical leaders, right? And in my view, they don't necessarily have to come from the state. They don't have to come from the state. Number of people in various sectors in society outside the state who, in my view, qualify to get us out of this crisis and put us on a different trajectory. Now, to conclude, to just give you an idea of the leadership crisis at the state level, right? Of our 257, right, municipalities, we learn from the Auditor General, right, that just about over 27 of them got clean audits. out of 257, you have about 27 municipalities, right, getting clean audits. And these are municipalities that are supposed to, amongst others, ensure ordinary people have electricity and water, right? Now, the critical question, in addition to all the important issues that have been raised, we must address the issue of ethical and transformative leadership, right, in this country, because a number of the people who are held up as our leaders are actually part of our problem, and they are our misleaders. Thank you. I want to leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Veli. And also just, I think, you know, what's coming out of the conversation, the contribution you're making to the conversation, that historical mapping of how we get to the problems that we're sitting with, and perhaps arguably the legacy of the crises that we're in. So thank you so much for that contribution. Colleagues, friends that are joining us, please feel free to post your questions, your comments at this stage, and we'll bring those into the conversation when we do open up for Q&A, for you to engage some of our panelists. Of course, also understanding that our audience comes from a variety of different spheres, students, experts, community members. So please do join in the conversation, whether you are joining us from Facebook or you are joining us from YouTube. Feel free to make use of the live chat function for you to pose your questions and your comments. All right. With that, I'm going to then give over to our next panelist, Dr. Gisela Kaiser, who is the Vice President at Water Globe Consultants. Dr. Kaiser is a civil engineer with an MBA and a PhD in construction management. Dr. Kaiser had been appointed as an executive director of utility services at the city of Cape Town, and in 2012, and then later for the Department of Informal Settlements, Water and Waste. And they are now based working on a project with the Nelson Mandela Metro, I understand. All right, Dr. Kaiser, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kazi, and thank you to my fellow panelists. And it's a privilege to be here with you. It was really interesting to listen to both Funzani and Veli. What I prepared, though, is a little bit different in addressing the challenge of how to begin to talk about growth and development with all the service problems that we have in South Africa. And I tend to always try to take a bigger view. So we're part of the world. So looking at how we are doing compared to the rest of the world, I thought was perhaps a good place to start. Just this morning, we heard on the news that our unemployment rate is now the highest in the world. So we seem to excel at things that are not necessarily things that you want to excel at. But looking from the perspective of the Human Development Index, which considers long and healthy life, knowledge, and a decent standard of living, South Africa is just into the bottom half of the countries, just below the median and the average, whereas the top 10 countries score 94. South Africa sits at just over 70%, and the lowest countries in the world are around the 0.46. So we're very much midway in that range. Why I thought this was maybe an important place to start is that I hold some hope that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is aimed at transforming the world, is possibly our biggest hope in making sure that we transform the world in a way that leaves nobody behind. Specifically, this is aimed at eradicating poverty in all forms and dimensions. That is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable growth into the future. So in 2015, the Millennium Goals were replaced by 17 Sustainable Development Goals with a target date of 2030. in critical areas of importance for people and the planet. And I find it heartening that the previously triple P approach has now been expanded to 5 Ps. So it's people, to end poverty and hunger, to fulfill human potential in dignity and equality and a healthy environment. Then we look at the planet, to protect the planet through sustainable consumption and production. We require urgent action on climate change, such as what Funzani mentioned, to support the needs of current and future people on the planet. Next, prosperity still features, but it's to enable everyone to enjoy a prosperous and fulfilling life. That social, economic, and technology progresses in harmony with nature. The new ones added really is peace, to foster peaceful, just, and inclusive societies as a whole that are free from fear and violence. And then also partnerships, so that we focus on the most vulnerable, but we require all countries to participate in meeting these goals. All the goals are interlinked, which requires building partnerships at all levels. If these goals are realized, the lives of all on the planet will be profoundly improved and the world will be transformed for the better. So specifically, I've been involved in the water space, and water is at the center of economic and social development around the world. It's vital to maintain our health, to grow food, to manage the environment, and to create jobs. But despite us acknowledging that water is so important, over 660 million people in the world still lack basic access to improved drinking water sources. And so for each of the 17 goals, there are a number of metrics. Because South Africa is part of sub-Saharan Africa, I just did a quick comparison of how we're doing in some of these goals. Just to have an overall view of it, our population is just above 58 million, approaching 60. The sub-Saharan Africa is just over 1 billion, and the world, of course, is around 8 billion. Our per capita GDP is slightly above the average of that in the world. And of course, metrics vary depending on how you measure it. And also the impact of COVID has reduced the overall world's GDP per person. But ours is just over 12,000 US dollars. The world average is at around 11. And that for sub-Saharan Africa is just under 4,000. So we're virtually at 3 times what it is for sub-Saharan Africa. When it comes to the percentage of the population that has access to safely managed drinking water, South Africa scores well. We're not perfect, it's not at 100, but it's at 80%, whereas sub-Saharan Africa is at 30% and the world as a whole at 74%. So there we are above the world's average. We're not doing that well with a good water quality in rivers and dams and so on. We, in fact, way below that of both sub-Saharan Africa and the world at 52%, whereas they're both in the 70s. Then when it comes to water stress, our country is very stressed. And we are drawing a lot of our renewable water sources compared to both the world and the rest of Africa. So we certainly need to work on that, but our integrated water resource management scores very well at 71%, as opposed to the world average of 54%. When it comes to energy, similar. Our access to electricity compared to sub-Saharan Africa, which is only at 20%, and the world average of 60%, we have access of 95%. Now, this, of course, doesn't talk about load shedding, but access to electricity, rolling out electricity networks across the country has been something that the country has done quite successfully. It's now keeping the lights on that is the challenge. And then in terms of renewable energy, we are absolutely lagging. We're only at 17%, which is below the world average of 18%, so not doing badly there, but the rest of sub-Saharan Africa is apparently at 70%. So there's certainly been an embracing of going for a decentralized model where people probably went off-grid and went for the solar option at a household level. So while access to renewables renewables is becoming more affordable. The point that Funzani made, I very much agree with, because we suffered the same challenge in Cape Town, that people want to go off grid, but as a municipality, you need to still derive income because the whole tariff structure is subsidized, and those people who cannot afford to pay for electricity need to be subsidized from somewhere. So there are ways and means of doing this. So where it makes sense to go off grid, those people who can afford to do it still need to pay towards the common good so that everybody can have access to services. I mentioned that this morning we topped the unemployment rate. Unfortunately, we also topped the Gini coefficient. Sub-Saharan Africa has become more unequal as it has grown, and their Gini coefficient now stands at about 0.5. South Africa sources tend to vary between 0.63 and 0.67, whereas the average Gini for the world is about 0.38. So that is not a scale that we want to excel at. And there, I think, I want to touch on Veli's point. We certainly are a troubled country, but the world is also troubled. But from a transformational viewpoint, perhaps we have the opportunity to do things in a different way and really build on our strengths. At the moment, we don't seem to be taking grasp of the opportunities which we have. I think there's a world of opportunity and possibility out there if we can learn how to work together and do things better in partnership. We need to stay at a human scale. We have to make sure that we don't leave anybody behind in our how we solve our problems. The SDGs may I ever seem to be very far out of reach and hard to achieve, but I think my main point is that they aim to resolve all the problems in a connected way, because often when you solve problems in isolation, other problems arise. And perhaps focusing on the SDG as a path, we are clearly part of it as South Africa, but we shouldn't just work on it as a metric. We should actually buy into it with our heart and souls to really try to address all of the SDGs. And that's where I'll end. Thank you very much, Kazi.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kaiser. I think, of course, what's interesting with how you frame your presentation, of course, or maybe what I think I is quite appreciative is how oftentimes when we talk about the continent, we always talk about it in comparison to the rest of the world. Here, for me, what you do is position us as part of the world, and I think that that's quite a different approach in how we also see ourselves as part of the global community, and that's part of the solution for how we all just sustain our livelihood. So I think I appreciate the way in which you frame that way. Thank you so much for your contribution. Colleagues, we are going to soon move into the Q&A. Quite excited to hear what all your thoughts are and just your opinions, and to hear what you think about the conversation. And if you'd like to engage some of our panelists, we absolutely welcome that. Before we do that, I want to welcome our last panelist, Tandokazi Nquma-Moyo, or Sis Tandokazi, sorry. Sis Tandokazi is a published scientist and a non-executive director in the Methano group. Tandokazi is also a business development manager at Technology Innovation Agency. Right, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Thank you so much. So good morning to everyone that's listening in on this dialogue. And thank you so much to the insightful conversations and thoughts and thought leadership from our panelists. So I'm going to speak on 2 points, wearing a hat of a technocrat, a trained technocrat. The second one, from a business perspective, as you might have heard, I'm a non-executive director of a mining company. It's an EPCM, which, what we term as a crisis. I've been trained as a scientist to see every challenge as an opportunity for growth and development. Actually, the drought and the electricity crisis should be a growth and a developmental trajectory for us as a country. So, for instance, generally in our own organization, what we've done is, because we saw the challenge in the electricity sector, we then diversified into alternative energy to try and find solutions. But I won't speak about Methano Group here today. I'm going to just speak about my perspective towards this conversation. So the first thing is 2008 hits us, we lost investments, the country totally was going into darkness. That's when load shedding hit South Africa. And 2015, that's when there was issues of water shortages and the drought. Now, the question is, was our country found with their pants down? Were we not ready for this challenge? What happened? What did we miss? Because if we're able to problematize or to identify what we missed, then we'll be able to respond to what we call as a crisis, but I would rather term as an opportunity for us as a country, I think, like Dr. Gisela has also mentioned. So the first thing is, I don't think we were caught with our pants down. I don't think we were necessarily not aware that these things would happen. But the question is, were we fast enough to respond or to be prepared that when they happen, our risk mitigation strategies would be up and running? That's one element. The second element is, so South Africa, from a number of years back, has made significant investments in research and development in the energy sector. I mean, we're talking about diversifying the energy sector quite significantly. Our base now is coal, and we looked at gas, we looked at wind, solar, hydro, storage. You mentioned all the types of renewable or energy sources, alternatives within in South Africa, and that was based on the fact that we knew as a country that we had these resources. Now, all that premise of investments into R&D, which I'm a product of 2008, I was called in as a biotechnologist to come in and help the country from a cohort of some of the top performing students to try and see what could we do with the electricity crisis in 2008. And we were helped to say, come on, guys, with your minds and with your, the way you approach things, can you help us to come with solutions of how we can address the electricity challenges? And we looked at alternative sources quite significantly. Now, one of the key things I want us to look at is that when you run a country, you should run a country like a business. Now, a business has to, for it to be sustainable and to grow, it has to, or a business must be kept, or for a country to be kept as a going concern, it needs to have a plan. And that plan needs to be its own plan. It needs to detect its own terms. It has to have a responsive strategy, or it has to have a decisive strategy. And the question is, with us as South Africa, do we have our own plan? Not someone else's plan that we assign to, but our own plan. And sitting here, I think as South Africa, we had our own plan. 20 years ago, we had our own plan. We've invested more than hundreds of billions in technologies that could be deployed as alternative energy sources. It was before 2008, by the way, with, top scientists working on new technologies. Wind, solar, you name them all. That could have been brought online way even maybe before 2008. That's one. And so the biggest thing in the electricity sector has been pace. Have we been fast enough as a country to translate our investments, which were meant to prepare us for a looming disaster? Because we knew for some, one day our resources, coal resources might, eventually get depleted. We're talking about fossil fuels. They're not renewable. They have to get depleted at some point. That's one. So any country requires a plan, a strategy, a risk mitigation plan to say, should all else fail, what do we have in the pocket? And of course, that would exclude any force majeure, which is acts of God, things that are beyond our control as a country. So fast forward, In the past 20 years, we invested greatly as a country in alternative energy sources because we knew that, there was going to be a significant change in fossil fuel, quantums that we had as a country. So as a resource country in terms of natural resources, we went in to do some research in all types of technologies. And we had significant results by 2010. And fast forward, we started what we call an integrated resource plan. But I think where we missed it as a country is in adopting or translating our own R&D investments into our own products. So what happened is that we've invested hundreds of billions of rands into technologies which were supposed to respond to depletion of our natural resources, which were not necessarily maybe not natural, our own fossil fuels, which were supposed to kick in when our fossil fuels dwindled down. But I think there was a shift that we then became dependent on the external world when ourselves we had the best expertise in the country. So I think the translation is because there's economies of scale. So if you measure me on price, if you measure me on track record, where will I get it? It's a new technology that you government has funded. But so there was a lot of challenge in adoption of these new technologies by our own country, which invested in them. And hence we saw a lot of imports of these technologies, which then ended up, buying out jobs, buying out skills. Our own people could not benefit, our own scientists, in terms of translation and adoption of those technologies which ourselves as a country have invested in. So that's where some of the biggest challenges are in terms of responding to the countries. In terms of technology, I think the country is doing quite well. Relatively well in terms of what we know we should have. But talking today, if you have a new solar PV or a waste to energy type of project, the amount or the time or the effort it takes for it to be adopted and be deployed by our own country is quite tedious. So that's one element. Now, getting into the water crisis. Now, the water crisis, there's several challenges around it of why we have it today. There's climate change. But again, I think we need to be honest. We have dams in South Africa to some extent. But if you go to where I come from in the Eastern Cape in Butterworth, the dam there is not functional. It's drying up. The infrastructure is dilapidated. The budget was given. Where did it go? Who are we blaming for that? We've got the infrastructure. I think my first colleague that spoke, Funzani, spoke about infrastructure. There is debating infrastructure in the country. We see every year budget towards water and sanitation, but we continue to have the same crisis. What is the problem? And of course, over and above problematizing and saying, what is it that is a problem, that when I go to my own town in Butterworth, I find a dam that is dried up, it's cracking, it's not serviced. And yet when you go to the municipal budget, there's a budget to sort out that dam. That's one. The second aspect is, in our country, we've invested significantly in water and sanitation technologies. We've invested significantly in technologies that should respond to dwindling water or rain due to climate change, right? We've got technologies that we've invested in to help with generating water from atmospheric pressure. But why are those technologies not being deployed? Is it procurement processes? Is it adoption? What is the problem? So I think my point is, the challenge we have in South Africa, there is solutions that are on the table for them. The question is adoption of those solutions. The technologies are there. We should start adopting technologies. As a country, we should find a way over and above our current procurement regime, which excludes its own technologies. How do we open those technologies up? We're talking about how the water sector hits, crops and the agricultural sector. If you go to my village where I grew up in Tsendane, most of the households, they depend honestly on vegetation. They are farmers. They depend on what they grow on their land and their fields. They've got big land, they've got big fields in the rural areas, but there's no rain. What do? The question is, have we seen an opportunity there to say, as scientists, where are drought-resistant varieties? Where are drought-resistant varieties of potatoes, of maize meal, of green peppers? We have to, and we know, for instance, we've got the ARC, the Agricultural Research Council. They've come up with these technologies. Why are they not reaching the hands of small-scale holder farmers? Why are they not, reaching the hands of subsistence farmers? Why are we not getting them on the shelf? So again, the deployment of technologies to save us from the crisis is one key factor that we need to address as a country. How do we have a procurement regime for new technologies which do not need and should not compete with other technologies outside the country? Now, if you go to China, colleagues, if you go to the USA, you will not see a South African company being awarded a tender or being awarded an opportunity to deploy a technology in the US. They give preference to their own startups. They give preference to their own innovators. That's how they set it up. Let's look at the USA, just as a classical example. The USA set up its own fund and its own instruments to adopt its technologies to build its defense sector, which is the one of the top performing in the world, to build its energy sector, to build its agricultural sector. We're talking about, brilliant nuclear power stations, which are keeping them afloat as we speak. They invested and they set up their own instruments called the Technology Acquisition and Deployment Fund to make sure that they grow their own technologies and they give preference to them when it comes to deployment. And that way, you are recycling money within your own country. So I think as a country, we need to have our own plan, not exclusively assigned to someone else's plan. We have our own plan, but the problem is the implementation of our own plan. We've put it in the hands of someone else. And I think we must start putting it in our own hands and investing in it quite properly. And once we do that, look at a country where we've got blue-collar workers working in factories that are manufacturing solar panels, developed in our own country, our country investing in all those things. Look at, artisans. Look at school leavers working, so both white and blue-collar skills required to deploy our own technologies. So we have a country that has done well in investing and planning, but the execution and implementing of that plan remains a key question. I think we're not in crisis of someone else's doing. I think we have a plan, but the crisis that we have is implementation of our own plan. I'll leave it there for now, Siphokazi.
Thanks so much, Sister Tandokazi. And I mean, I think there also you're touching really on the theme of one is this leadership question, and I think that's what's flagging up in terms of the lack of implementation when there's so many good plans in place. And also just touching on how various other states have managed to insource and to be able to stabilize their own economies and their own human resources for the sustainability of their own states, right? Which is something that we don't do so very well in terms of innovation and advancement. And that's often something that we outsource as a country. I'm seeing some engagements coming in, but before we go into that, I'm just going to pose some questions maybe to the panelists, just maybe one round of questions, and after that I'll open it up to everyone else that's bringing in their questions from our Facebook Live and from our YouTube streaming. So please continue putting your comments and your questions there. I'll probably just pose one question each to the panelists, but also as the panelists have been listening to each other, I'm sure there's been some thoughts that have been coming through some points of similarity. And I think quite interestingly, this conversation has been very social science orientated, very interestingly. I think across the common thread is how all the panelists have been able to offer their reflections, but also just center people and center how society is thus impacted by that. And really, I think that we can appreciate that. I think I'm going to pose to two panelists, but of course, the questions are direct to the panelists, but if you feel you want to tackle, also just mention some of the points that you're hearing from your colleagues, also feel free to do that. I think the one question, Sister Tandokazi was talking about, perhaps to you, Dr. Kaiser, particularly because you are an engineer. Dr. Sister Tandokazi is talking about how we should be ready, we should be prepared, we have this in place. maybe it's an implementation problem. And so when we think about the metro, for example, and how this is an incredibly rainy area, but for some reason we run into a drought, how is that a possible thing for us to be constantly running into a drought when here's an alternative, right? Do we not, is it really an infrastructure question? Is it a leadership question? And if so, how then do we address that? Perhaps that's my question to you. And then as you get ready to speak, maybe the question I'll pose to Veli. I mean, Veli was talking about how we need to think about ethical leadership, but also Veli, you know, at the beginning you're talking about us being in the state of darkness, but this figurative state of darkness. And I mean, I can resonate with that. And I'm thinking about how there's been some developments coming in. We're thinking about the Kolobeni mining project, and how that gives us here an opportunity for us to develop, right? But it becomes quite in serious contention with the community, with the values of the community, with the values of the environment. How then do we deal with that tension of a possible development opportunity? Perhaps just comment on that, with the tensions of how the development opportunities we have are often in contention with the ethos of what society believes in or how they live. And another example is also Port St. John's, some of their rivers as well. People commercializing the space, and those rivers and the water, they've been actually necessary for spiritual reasons, right? Just offer some commentary on that. So I'll give over to Dr. Kaiser as well to start off. Thanks, Doc.
Thanks so much, Kadi. Yeah, indeed. In Nelson Mandela Bay, currently we are in the grips of a water shortage crisis. So this really is due to low rainfall and runoff. We must keep in mind that while rainfall in Nelson Mandela Bay is generally an indicator whether there is rainfall in our catchments, the local dams are situated to the west of the city, and sometimes it can pour here and the catchment areas will see absolutely no rain. So in Kocha, the Kocha Dam catchment, it's been shown that runoff is worse than the statistical estimate of a 1 in 1,000 year drought. So that is quite extreme. And to plan for a drought like that will not ever make economic sense. In the Crom for the Churchill and in Mpofu dams, it is somewhat less. In Cape Town, in the drought as well, it was statistically calculated to be a 1 in 600 year drought, but it was made 4 times more likely due to the impact of climate change. So I think that certainly for us, we are in a changing environment, that we are not sure how quickly climate change is going to affect climate. Our weather patterns change the whole time. There are huge unseasonal events, and both drought and floods will become a lot more common. So what worldwide people who are planning for water resources are looking at is to diversify supply, so that you're not reliant only on one dam that is reliant on rainfall or on dams in a single area. Where Nelson Mandela Bay is quite fortunate is that we get approximately, under unrestricted times, we get approximately half our water from up north, from the Kharib Dam, which is in a completely different catchment area. And as such, we already have a diversity of supply. What we don't have, and what we're currently busy working on really hard, is to interconnect so that we can use water from the Kharib Dam to serve the entire Bay area. At the moment, it's only serving approximately half the households, but our interconnecting infrastructure will be complete functionally so that we can start to use it by the end of April next year. So our challenge is to make sure that we keep sufficient water in the local dams to take us through until the end of April. And then on top of that, what other countries are doing are adding groundwater. They are reusing more of their water and then treating seawater so that it can become to a potable standard as well. But if you think about it, rainfall that falls from the sky into the dam is by far the cheapest source. So from my experience, it is better, in fact, to wait for international technology to evolve further so that it becomes more affordable and you don't buy an expensive thing that you then have to pay for and it doesn't work well. So yeah, I think we are short of time, so I'm not going to take more of your time. Thanks, Kazi.
Yeah, thanks, Doc, and also just giving us that information as well, in terms of just how the practicality of the entire system works, and what that means for us, possibly, or will not mean for us. So thank you so much for that. Veli, over to you.
Mute. Okay. Thanks you, Sis Siphokazi, and once again, I welcome and appreciate the insights that were shared by the fellow panelists. They were very enriching from my own perspective. So the question that you've asked, I'm glad that you have touched on a subject that's very close to my heart. I've followed and written a lot on it, which is the community of Xolobeni, right? And their fight with this Australian company. Now, that is a classical case of the point that Sister Funzani was making initially about how hegemonic and just how violent, right, neoliberal economic models are in that they impose, So the Australian company thinks it knows what's best for the people of Xolobeni, who have lived there for millennia, this is part of the problem. So they phrase these things as development, they are projected as development, but when you actually look at it, right, these are nothing else but hostile takeovers, of people's resources. And in the case of Xolobeni, apart from, as you know, the matter having gone as far as the High Court, but there has also been a lot of mysterious killings of the Amadiba Crisis Committee members who are leading the community of Xolobeni. And the most high-profile killing has been that of their leader, Ubaba Upazuka Sikosi Pikhatebe, And one of the things that we don't talk about in this country is how communities are pitted against multinational corporations, and they are being pushed. I mean, even around the Kruger National Park area, right? Communities around the Kruger, there has been that level of dispossession and violence. So again, it is the issue that I raised initially, right? As to who defines the discourse of what we call a crisis or even development, and it's a global phenomenon. I'll give you examples on the African continent to just show you what is happening in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, which is an oil-rich region, right? The dominant narrative is that of rebels and violence in that area when you hear Niger Delta. What you are not being told is how companies like Shell, right, have violently captured the oil, the petroleum resources of ordinary people in the Niger Delta. You don't hear that, right? Then you have another case of what is happening in the DRC now, right? The dominant narrative is that of DRC being in a state of civil war. What you are not being told is how Western companies, and especially US companies, continue to extract, cobalt and coltan from the DRC to make cell phones, Nintendos, and other types of things. So it is one of those things. Look at what's happening in the area that is rich with natural gas in Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, right? The dominant narrative, again, as per the media, is that there is an armed insurgency. They are even implicating organizations like ISIL, right? But what they are not telling us is that which companies are currently in control of the natural gas resources of Cabo Delgado, French, Italian, and American companies. So the whole notion of what constitutes development and progress, is part of the problematic on the African continent. And this is why when we sometimes say there's no progress in our own countries, I mean, you've heard concepts like failed states. Failed states by whose standards? Lack of development as defined by who? And who says the Western notion of development is universal? It is not. We must set our own standards of what constitutes development, progress, because we have our own minds and we have our own value system. So for me, that is the problematic thing that we need to sort out. And at the center of it is when we have ethical leaders would understand that you can't impose development on a people, right? Otherwise, it's not development.
That's fair. Thank you so much, Veli. I'm going to pose just a question to Tandokazi. I mean, also thinking about what Veli is just talking about mining companies, but also multinational companies, you having experience in the mining sector, if you'd like to offer some commentary there. But some of what you were talking about, of course, is how other countries have made this investment in technologies to advance themselves, and how there's an interconnectedness, I suppose, or lack of interconnectedness between the sectors we have in our country. And I'm wondering if the higher education sector is quite responsive to the needs that we need in terms of innovation and in terms of producing a particular type of skill set, right, that's going to be able to give us these type of technologies that you are talking about. So maybe just reflections on that. And then for this Funzani, you made mention a little bit, but Tandokazi then talks about, renewable energy and the opportunities there. And of course, there's been biddings that the government has made for solar energy and for wind energy. I'm wondering, now that we're seeing the unemployment rates rising, if renewable energy is not giving us opportunities there to address that unemployment question. Just your thoughts there, Sis Funzani. But we'll start with you, Sis Tandokazi.
Thank you so much, Fogi. Let me start with the one on universities and new technologies and so forth. So I think I'll tie it to what Dr. Gisela talked about in the Nelson Mandela Bay. So I haven't spent some close 5 years in Nelson Mandela Bay, having done having worked at the Kucha Industrial Development Zone, where we had our first wind turbine, and I was a project manager for that. One of the things that I think Nelson Mandela Bay, and I thought maybe Dr. Gisela would mention it, is water desalination, which is a very expensive exercise and technology, but I think there's some value in it if you look at the techno-economic feasibility around it, right? And it's just a matter of appetite. Do we have an appetite in our decisive country, but that we want to secure our own plan? If we think that we're a very coastal country, we've got a lot of water resources, therefore we can use those privileges. So over and above infrastructure, Nelson Mandela Bay in itself, there's a lot of opportunities there. So I hope the water desalination project, I think that Kucha is involved in, it takes a lot of shape, because I think it will support the region quite significantly. Now let's go back to an imbalance. You say, Spoke, you mentioned a very important aspect: universities. Universities in any country. If you look at how AstraZeneca was born, let's talk about the COVID. Just on principle, the COVID vaccine, the first one, which was a groundbreaking news. Who developed that technology? Who developed the product? It was Oxford universities, because that's where your minds and the people that have the time and the skill to develop products are sitting. And then it was spun out to AstraZeneca. A lot of the multi-billion rand companies that we see today in tech, they were born out of universities. So what South Africa has done, they saw that that in universities we're sitting with gold mines, right, of where we can establish our own entities. Let me talk about one of the, the three successes of South Africa when it comes to the energy space, which was born out, the technologies that they're deploying was born out of universities. One of those is the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation, which I was previously employed in, NECSA. Unfortunately, they're not having any power. They're not using their nuclear reactor for power generation or electricity generation at the moment. I think I've seen in the news they're getting about 2,400 megawatts or so from the IRP, for nuclear, for generating electricity through nuclear, which is a good thing because we have those resources. But it's R1 billion. They spun out R1 billion organization. Highly transformed. The entire group itself, the NECSA group, it has a Pelchem, which is chemicals. Maybe the toothpaste you're using, there might be chemicals just from here attached in South Africa. So investments in R&D, and that's translating. It's something we've done quite well. And this is stuff that has come out. The intellectual property that has led to the establishment of those companies was mostly born out of universities. We're talking about Eskom. We're talking about Sasol, the Fischer-Tropsch method that is used by Sasol now, for producing the petrol and oil, whatever, is some of the work which has done at my alma mater, at the Northwest University in Potchefstroom. So the universities, we're sitting with gold mines of where we can translate intellectual property there into multi-billion-dollar rands companies without having to borrow technologies from outside. Of course, there's room. I'm wearing a hat of a technocrat. There's a room for what we call inbound technology transfer, whereby we know within the country we don't have the skill, we don't have the scientists, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't maybe need to invest in it, where we can bring in some of these technologies. But when we bring them in, we ensure knowledge transfer, we customize them, we build the capacity within the country. If we have to buy the scientists and get them to be citizens of South Africa, maybe we could. So it's training our own scientists from scientists sitting everywhere in the country. We're talking about graduates who are doing science. They must be trained to develop solutions, not to, I'm just going to study science and I'm going to go and wait in a queue at the municipality to be an engineer that cleans water. So it's about training of the mind. So what South Africa did, because they saw the power of IP sitting in universities to solve the challenges we're talking about today, they set up what we call technology transfer offices. This is the Department of Science and Innovation. They set up what we call technology transfer offices. The technology transfer offices within all the universities in South Africa, about 23 out of the 26 has fully functional tech transfer offices. And the other 3 that don't have it because they're fairly new and they're starting them up, they're setting them up. So those tech transfer offices are small business development or business support offices that are meant to translate whatever intellectual property or research outcomes that come out of the university that could be established into a business or partner into a business. We're talking about, and science councils as well. They've got the same tech transfer offices. They've got professionals who are meant to protect South Africa's intellectual property from leakage, from unfair benefits, each leaving the country without the country benefiting, and then we buy it back. They are meant to ensure benefit sharing. When you have come out with that intellectual property, you're able to share the benefits with the inventor and the investor and the country at large. So that space of research, technology, and innovation to support the crisis that we're talking about today, or the opportunity or the challenges we have today, is there. And we have a portfolio of those technologies sitting there. It's just a matter of, one of the biggest challenges we have the country is an imbalance. The country has done so well into investing in discovering problems, but we're not doing so well in investing in producing products or solutions towards those problems. So we see an imbalance in the investment on research and development, but in terms of commercializing or productizing or putting to the market those technologies, it's very minute. And it's a challenge. I think it's a topic on its own that we'd have to discuss, the issue of translation of those innovations or technologies into commercializable products. And that's where the country lacks investing in those and translating them. The third one you're mentioning is the mining sector. Now, let me tell you about the value proposition about Africa. It's mind-boggling. one of the key value propositions of Africa is our natural resources. We've got oil in Nigeria. We've got, in South Africa, we've got fluorspar. We've got, we've got all the reason why global mining companies flood into South Africa is because of the resources. Now, this is what happens in the mining industry. South Africa is not decisive or proactive about supporting the growth of its own mining industry. If you see how much is given in research and technology in the mining industry, it's very minute versus what is required. So they come in with, they're existing, they're operating, they come in with big budgets, right? And they come in and they say, look, we'll, deploy jobs. And so it's but what we need to do as a country is to then say, how do we ensure optimum benefit sharing in those transactions or those deals, those investments in our country to help us to beneficiate our minerals. How do we ensure, benefit sharing, proper benefit sharing, trust for communities, all those kind of things. So what we're doing, for instance, in our own company, we know that when we're going to do a project in one area as Methano, there is proper training for people in that region, proper trust to take those people to schools, what we call corporate social investment. So we're not just building houses or we're just giving them food. No, they must be skilled. That maybe when this mining company or the people grow old in this company, they're able to take over this company. There must be ownership share. So the value of South Africa in the mining is the resources. And the question is, how do we appropriate proper benefit sharing, sustainable one, not just for the stomach or just food parcels. I'll end there for now.
Thank you so much, Sister Tandokazi. I'm going to give over to Sis Funzani. But as you are addressing that, there's a question that has come specifically for you, Funzani, that I think I should just bring into the conversation as well. The question for you is coming from Ulsiya Mama, saying, great input, Funzani, enjoyed your critique of budget, artistry, and privatization. I'm interested in your thoughts about how investment has now focused on financial sectors and how this contributes to the crisis of unemployment. Also, what does this current GDP mean when there's a high risk of illicit financial flows? So perhaps you can just address those questions together. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question, and from both yourself and is it Sia? I hope I got that right. Okay, so I think there are two things that I would actually like to address. Number one is that there is a shift in our economy, right, that is happening. In that you asked a question about whether the renewable energy sector is kind of like a sector where we could see opportunities of employment. And I would like to say yes, but another aspect of it is that we have a problem of structural unemployment in South Africa, right? So in that, the skills that is demanded is not necessarily the skills that is in supply within our economy, right? There's a mismatch between our skills supply and skills demand because of this economic shift, right? So as you know that we are moving towards your AIs, your renewable energy sectors and whatnot. So what does it mean for employees or workers that actually work in the mines? If we're going to move away from, for instance, fossil fuels to clean energy, what would that mean? How do we actually address the question of workers within those particular spaces? So for instance, the Eastern Cape, right, currently is one of the provinces with like the largest number of wind projects, right, at a value of about 20 billion. That is about 43% of the total wind capacity procured under the Renewable Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. So that actually does show you that there's actually opportunities there, especially because the Eastern Cape in particular has one of the highest, or is the highest, the highest unemployment rate in the country. And so renewable energy sector is a sector that we can look into in terms of job opportunities, but there is still a question of then what happens to workers that have been in the space of fossil fuels. And I think that's one of the one of the critique, I suppose, from labor unions in the country that they have raised so well to say, but what does this actually mean for us? If there's going to be this transition, what does it actually mean for us? And I think that's one of the things that we need to address. Another thing is the question of structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is actually one of the biggest issues that we have. If we're going to have a particular economic transition, if we're going to move from one dominating industry to another, we have to make sure that we address issues that are related to that. And I suppose this is all related in terms of like the energy sector and in terms of the energy sector and unemployment. So I think the other question was about GDP and financialization, GDP growth. What else? Sorry, please repeat that question.
Okay, no worries. The question is, just for you to give your comments or your thoughts rather, on how investment has now focused on financial sectors and how this contributes to the crisis of unemployment, which you've addressed. But what does this current GDP mean when there's a high rise of illicit financial flows?
I mean, I think in terms of like the investment kind of shifting into the financial sector, the financial sector is actually the dominating sector, like within our economy. And so or rather, I think it's part of the service sector, which is basically part of the financial sector. But what happens with the current type of neoliberal economy that we have is that the financial sector is able to find expression even in sectors that are not necessarily financial, right? And so that's what financialization is about, kind of having a dominant financial market, even like having financial market actors dominating across all sectors, not just only within the financial sector. So what then is happening is that the financial sector is not only growing as the financial sector, but it's growing dependent on all the other sectors as well. And that's also one of the points that I actually made earlier about how how the financial markets have realized that climate justice is important at this point for their own profitability, though, right? So the reasoning behind the market forces being interested, the financial market forces being interested within climate justice and whatnot, should be interrogated, because in most cases it's about preserving the capital and capitalism where it's at. So it's for me, I'd call it like a reproducing of capitalism in some ways, and capitalism managing to find expression even in sectors that are not necessarily financial. So right now, the dominating conversation is on climate change, is on energy, and the private sector, or rather finance, does find expression in those spaces. So in terms of the investment, I would say that at this point, I feel like the investment within the financial sector is not just only on financial sectors and like banks and the typical financial sector, insurances and whatnot, but it cuts across all sectors for shareholder benefits. And in terms of our GDP as well, it is estimated that we will be having like about 1.7, 1.6% growth on average in the next 5 years for GDP, but that's also because we're coming from a low base due to COVID and whatnot. So that would be interesting to see exactly which sectors would dominate that drive, because what we know and what we saw currently with the midterm budget, for instance, what we saw is that we have had some money coming, like some extra tax money coming from the commodity boom, about 120 billion that came from the commodity boom that happened earlier this year. So the question now becomes, how would that money be actually utilized in order to, ensure that our GDP actually grows. So there are obviously two aspects to it. Another aspect would be because the finance minister wants to create a surplus, that money may not necessarily be spent, right? And then there's another aspect that says, well, spend it on social issues, spend it on development, ensure that actually we spend this money so that we push our GDP growth. So there are various kind of interesting aspects and perspective when it comes to our GDP and our and then I think there was another question about illicit financial outflows and inflows, whatever. Even on that, right? For me, I think Veli touched on it earlier. That's also part of what I would call financialization. South Africa, because of its liberalized finance, right? It is kind of susceptible to having these illicit financial flows, happening easily as compared to like developed. Also because we are vulnerable because we are a developing country and not necessarily a developed country. I would leave it there.
Thanks so much, Sis Funzani. And also, I'm just being alerted that I have not managed my time very well. So I'm just going to close. I would have loved to give the panelists to close, but I don't think that that's possible. I also just want to, of course, express great appreciation to our panelists and just the conversation coming out quite interlinked. The question of climate and renewable energy sources right now. What are these new technologies that we need to be considering, but also just centering our human resource? What are the skill sets that we have? What are the implications of development for society? So thank you so much to the panelists and to everyone that's joining in. Just looking at the comments, quite positive comments, everyone just enjoying the robustness and the diversity of your inputs in this panel today. Of course, just hoping that at some stage we get to do this physically like before. I'm now going to allow Uncle Rodney Busach, who's the Community Liaison Officer at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, just to offer us a vote of thanks and some closing comments. Uncle Rodney?
Thank you, Kazi. Firstly, on behalf of the Nelson Mandela University and then also the Herald newspaper, which is hosting the community dialogues, I want to obviously thank each and everyone that have contributed towards this particular dialogue, especially the facilitator, Kazi, in terms of the manner that you have managed the dialogue and also in terms of how you have a way of unlocking maximum discussion and dialogue on this particular matter. To the panelists, Gisela, Funzani, Veli, and Tandokazi, thank you for your valuable contributions, your insightfulness in terms of making a success of this particular dialogue. This is our last dialogue, the fourth one within this particular series, and we want to thank you for your contributions. Also, thank you for taking out the time out to come and share your knowledge with our participants. Very much thank you. Especially to those also that have commented, that have asked questions. Thank you for taking the time out. Without the participants, there's no dialogue. So they place an important part towards that. To the organizing team, which consists of the Herald and then CANRAD, which falls under university. Thank you for your commitment in making these dialogues possible and always bringing up important and interesting topics to be discussed and involving the community around engaging in these particular matters. Not forgetting the technical team and especially from the Herald, they are working usually tirelessly behind the scenes in making this possible in terms of having it as a flawless and on-time event that is usually happening. Thank you everyone for your contributions and stay safe.